On the night of January 27, 1986, a mechanical engineer named Roger Boisjoly drove home from work, walked into his house, and told his wife 4 words: "It's going to blow up." He had spent the previous 3 hours on a conference call with NASA, fighting with everything he had to stop the launch of the Space Shuttle Challenger scheduled for the following morning. He had shown them his data. He had shown them his photographs. He had shown them 6 months of warnings he had put in writing and handed to every manager above him. And NASA had told his company to get back on the line when they were ready to stop acting like engineers and start thinking like managers. His company had done exactly that. They had overruled him and his colleagues. They had told NASA the launch was a go. Boisjoly went to bed knowing he had failed. He lay there in the dark, knowing what was going to happen in the morning, and he couldn't stop it. The next morning, he refused to watch the launch in the corporate auditorium where his colleagues were gathered to celebrate. He couldn't stand the idea of watching a countdown while knowing what he knew. He went instead to a colleague's office, where they watched on a small screen, alone. When Challenger cleared the launch tower and the first seconds passed without disaster, his colleague leaned over and whispered, 13 seconds. At 73 seconds, the shuttle disappeared in a fireball over the Atlantic. The last words recorded from the crew before structural breakup were the pilot's voice, calm and confused, saying 2 words, "Uh-oh." Roger Boisjoly knew exactly what had happened. So did everyone else in that room. They sat in silence and said nothing, because there was nothing left to say. 7 people died on January 28, 1986. Their names were Francis Scobie, Michael Smith, Ronald McNair, Ellison Onizuka, Judith Resnick, Gregory Jarvis, and Christa McAuliffe, a high school teacher from Concord, New Hampshire, who had been selected from 11,000 applicants to be the first civilian in space. Millions of school children across America were watching the launch live on classroom television sets because their teacher was on board. The story you have been told about Challenger is that it was a tragedy, a terrible accident, an engineering failure that nobody could have predicted. That story is wrong. One man predicted it in writing 6 months before it happened. He predicted it with enough precision that his memo used the exact phrase, a catastrophe of the highest order, that would be used to describe what actually occurred. And the people who received that memo launched the shuttle anyway. This is the story of the night before and the 6 months before that. And what happens when an institution decides that the schedule matters more than the truth? To understand what Roger Boisjoly saw that nobody else wanted to see, you have to understand one very simple piece of engineering. The space shuttle's solid rocket boosters, the 2 white pillars attached to the side of the orbiter that provided the initial thrust off the launch pad, were built in segments. Each segment was manufactured separately and assembled at the launch site. Where the segments joined, there needed to be a seal, something that would prevent the superheated gases inside a rocket burning at thousands of degrees from escaping through the joints and burning through the hull. That seal was called an O-ring. It was, in essence, a very large rubber band. Rubber has a property that every engineer who has ever worked with it understands immediately. When it is warm, it is soft and pliable and compresses easily into gaps, creating a tight seal. When it is cold, it becomes hard and slow and stiff, and it takes longer to respond to pressure. In a rocket joint that needed to seal in the first fraction of a second after ignition, a cold, slow O-ring was not a minor inconvenience. It was a potential catastrophe. If the gas got past the primary O-ring before it sealed, it would begin eating through the backup ring. If it ate through that too, it had a clear path to the external fuel tank and the wing of the orbiter. Boisjoly had been studying the O-rings since he joined Morton Thiokol in the early 1980s. What he found in the data from previous launches disturbed him. In flight after flight, in conditions that were warmer than anything he was now being asked to approve, the O-rings had shown signs of erosion. Hot gas had leaked past the primary seal. Not enough to cause disaster, but enough to damage it. Enough to show that the system was not performing as designed. And enough to tell anyone paying close attention that if the temperature dropped further, the margin between erosion and catastrophe would get thinner. In January of 1985, the shuttle had launched in conditions colder than any previous flight. That launch produced the most O-ring damage ever recorded. Boisjoly noted it. He added it to his data. He continued to watch. What he saw was a pattern that pointed in one direction and one direction only. And in July of 1985, he decided he could no longer keep that conclusion inside an internal working group. On July 31st, 1985, 6 months before Challenger launched, Roger Boisjoly sat down and wrote a memo to his vice president of engineering, Bob Lund. It was not the first memo he had written about the O-rings. It was not even the most detailed. But it was the one that said, plainly and without qualification, what he believed the data was telling him. He wrote that if the O-ring problem was not addressed, the result would be, and these were his exact words, a catastrophe of the highest order, involving the loss of human life. He was not speaking in hypotheticals. He was not running a worst-case scenario for a risk assessment document. He was telling his vice president of engineering that, in his professional opinion, if the shuttle kept launching on its current schedule without fixing the seal design, a crew was going to die. The memo was received. A task force was convened. Boisjoly was put on it. A month into the task force's work, he realized that it had been given no power, no budget, and no meaningful management support. The task force was, in his assessment, a way of appearing to address the problem without actually addressing it. Flights continued to be scheduled. The calendar kept moving forward. NASA had an ambitious launch schedule and a nation watching, and the pressure to keep the program moving was enormous. In late 1985, Boisjoly told his managers directly that there was a distinct chance a shuttle mission would end in disaster if the O-ring problem was not fixed. No action was taken. The launch of Mission 51L Challenger was set for January 28, 1986. The temperature forecast for launch day in Florida was 29 degrees Fahrenheit. That was 24 degrees colder than the coldest launch ever attempted. It was so far outside the available data that Boisjoly later described it as launching into the unknown. Except he already knew, from the data he had, exactly which direction the unknown pointed. At 8:45 in the evening of January 27th, a conference call began between Morton Thiokol's headquarters in Utah and NASA's Marshall Space Flight Center in Florida. The shuttle was scheduled to launch at 11:38 the following morning. The temperature at the Cape was forecast to hit 29 degrees Fahrenheit overnight and be in the low 30s at launch time. NASA had never launched at anything below 53 degrees. The reason for the call was the O-rings. Boisjoly and 4 colleagues presented their case. They walked NASA through the data on O-ring erosion, temperature correlation, and the specific risks of launching in conditions 24 degrees colder than anything in the flight record. Their position was unequivocal. Do not launch tomorrow. The data does not support it. The risk is unacceptable. NASA's response was not a counter-argument. It was a challenge. George Hardy, a senior official at Marshall, told Thiokol he was appalled by their recommendation. Those were his words. Appalled. Lawrence Mulloy, the shuttle program manager, did not hide his frustration. "My God, Thiokol," he said. "When do you want me to launch? Next April?" The message was clear. NASA needed this launch. The program was behind schedule. The Teacher in Space mission had been publicized across the country for months. The pressure was real, and it was coming down the line, and Thiokol's managers felt it. Thiokol asked for a 5-minute recess. The phone was muted. In the Utah conference room, Jerry Mason, Thiokol's senior vice president, looked around at the table and said something that Roger Boisjoly would quote for the rest of his life. He said it was time to make a management decision. He said they needed to take off their engineering hats and put on their management hats. Bob Lund, the vice president of engineering who had received Boisjoly's July memo, the man whose job it was to be the technical conscience of the room, looked at his boss, and he changed his recommendation. Boisjoly tried one more time. He stood up, walked to the table, spread his photographs of O-ring erosion from previous cold launches in front of the managers, and said as clearly as he could, "This is what happens. This is what the data shows." His colleague Arnie Thompson stood up too, physically moved to where the managers were sitting, and tried to sketch the problem out on a notepad right in front of them. When it became clear that neither of them was getting through, they both stopped. There was nothing more they could do. The phone was unmuted. Bob Lund told NASA the launch was a go. Boisjoly sat back in his chair. Later, he described the physical sensation as a kind of sickness. Not nausea exactly, but a certainty settling into his body like weight. He drove home. He told his wife it was going to blow up. He went to bed. The launch pad at Cape Canaveral on the morning of January 28th looked like something from a different climate. Icicles hung from the gantry structure. The ground crews were working in temperatures that nobody had planned for when the Florida launch site was designed. The overnight low had reached 27 degrees Fahrenheit, 2 degrees colder than the forecast, 2 degrees colder than an already unprecedented low. In classrooms across the country, teachers were wheeling television sets to the front of the room so their students could watch. Christa McAuliffe had been selected from 11,000 applicants to be the first teacher in space, and NASA had made her the human face of this particular mission. Children in New Hampshire, where she taught, had been following her journey for months. At Thiokol's facility in Utah, some of the engineers who had argued against the launch the night before gathered around television screens. Some expected the explosion to happen on the pad. When the engines ignited and the shuttle cleared the tower, one engineer exhaled. "Oh God," he said, "we made it. We made it." The relief in the room was real. Maybe they had been wrong. Maybe the O-rings had held. Maybe this would be one of those cases where the worst-case scenario turned out to be survivable. At 58 seconds after launch, high-altitude winds hit the shuttle. The joint that had been held together by a partially degraded O-ring was subjected to stress it could no longer absorb. A plume of flame appeared on the side of the right solid rocket booster, visible on camera, visible to the engineers watching in Utah, visible to the thousands of spectators at the Cape. Pilot Michael Smith said, "Uh-oh." Those were the last words recorded from the crew of Challenger. At 73 seconds after launch, the external fuel tank failed. The shuttle disintegrated. What the cameras showed was a white cloud expanding against the blue sky, and 2 solid rocket boosters spiraling away from it in opposite directions, still burning, tracing white lines across the blue like something had been torn in half. In classrooms across the country, children watched their teacher disappear. In Utah, the engineers sat in silence. They knew what had happened, they knew why, and they knew, with a precision that was almost unbearable, that they had been right. Roger Boisjoly did not become a hero after Challenger. Not immediately. Not within the institutions that employed him. When the Presidential Commission, known as the Rogers Commission, was assembled to investigate the disaster, Boisjoly was called to testify. He brought his memos. He described the teleconference. He described the moment Jerry Mason told his engineers to put on their management hats. He described standing at the table spreading photographs that nobody looked at. He described watching Bob Lund, the engineer who received his July memo, the man who had initially recommended against launch, reverse his position under pressure from a customer who was annoyed at the delay. He called the teleconference an unethical decision-making forum resulting from intense customer intimidation. He said it plainly, on the record, in front of a presidential investigation. The one person who acknowledged what he had done, publicly and physically, was Sally Ride, the first American woman in space, who was serving on the Rogers Commission. After his testimony, she walked over to him and gave him a hug. Boisjoly later said, "She was the only one. The only one." After his testimony, life at Morton Thiokol became impossible. Colleagues who had been friends stopped making eye contact in the corridors. He was removed from projects. He was excluded from meetings. The people who ran the organization he had tried to save from itself treated him the way institutions always treat the person who tells the truth at the wrong moment. Not with gratitude, but with the cold efficiency of someone being quietly removed from the picture. He developed severe headaches. He was later diagnosed with post-traumatic stress. He resigned from Thiokol and never worked in the aerospace industry again. He spent the next 2 decades doing something unexpected. He became an ethics lecturer. He took what had happened: the memos, the teleconference, the management hats, the icicles on the gantry, the 73 seconds, and he turned it into more than 300 presentations delivered to engineering schools, business schools, and corporate audiences across the country. His subject was not Challenger specifically. His subject was what happens in organizations when the people who hold the data are overruled by the people who hold the schedule. He told the story so that other engineers would know what it felt like to be right and be ignored, and so that other managers might pause for a moment before they told an engineer to put on a different hat. Richard Feynman, the Nobel Prize-winning physicist who also served on the Rogers Commission, had found his own way to make the same point. At a public hearing, he took a piece of O-ring rubber, clamped it in a metal vise, and dropped it into a glass of ice water. He let it sit for a few minutes, then he unclamped it and held it up. The rubber did not spring back. It held the compressed shape, stiff and slow to recover. He looked at the camera and said, in the understatement of the entire investigation, "I believe that has some significance for our problem. Here is the thing about institutions. They are very good at learning the lesson they want to learn, and very good at ignoring the lesson they do not." After Challenger, NASA grounded the shuttle program for 32 months. It redesigned the O-rings. It reformed its internal communication structures. It issued new guidelines about how engineers' concerns were to be escalated and recorded. The Rogers Commission made 9 recommendations, and NASA accepted all of them. 17 years later, in February of 2003, the Space Shuttle Columbia broke apart during re-entry, killing all 7 crew members on board. The cause was a piece of foam insulation that had struck the leading edge of the wing during launch and damaged the heat shield. Engineers had flagged the foam strike during the mission. They had asked NASA management for satellite imaging to assess the damage. NASA management decided the foam strike was not a serious threat, declined the imaging request, and did not tell the crew. The Columbia Accident Investigation Board, reviewing the disaster afterward, found that the organizational culture at NASA that had allowed Challenger to happen had not fundamentally changed in the 17 years between the 2 disasters. The pressures were different. The specific technical failure was different. The organizational dynamic in which the people who held the schedule overruled the people who held the data was the same. Roger Boisjoly did not live to comment publicly on Columbia. He died on January 6, 2012, at the age of 73, from complications of cancer. He had spent 26 years delivering the same message to anyone who would listen. He had received awards for professional integrity and personal courage. He had been recognized by NASA, which gave him a certificate of appreciation for his role in the Challenger investigation. The same organization whose officials had told his company, the night before the launch, that they were appalled by the recommendation to delay. In every presentation he ever gave, Boisjoly returned to the same moment. Not the launch, not the explosion, not the testimony. The moment in the conference room in Utah, on the evening of January 27th, when he spread his photographs on the table in front of the people who had the power to stop the launch and watched them look away. He had shown them everything. They had seen it. They had chosen the schedule. 73 seconds.